Now we will talk about ground squirrels.
I always put ground squirrels first because it is without a doubt the species that I get the most questions about. And most of the species that I'm talking about today are going to be based on kind of the amount of questions that I get. But the first thing I do is tell people they need to know what they are talking about. What is this animal? Here in Montana and in a lot of the West, people call things gophers. And they may be referring to a pocket gopher that is really a gopher, or they may be referring to a ground squirrel, which is really a ground squirrel, but most everybody calls them gophers. The control of these animals is very, very different, both from a biological and a legal standpoint, so it's really important to know the differences. Pocket gophers, which this section is not about, but it's the thing you're most likely to be confused with, pocket gophers live almost exclusively underground. Almost underline that, make it glow, they're underground. And somebody says, yeah, I just saw a pocket gopher running around out in the yard here. No. You don't see pocket gophers running around. Usually, there's always exceptions, but generally pocket gophers spend their life underground. They have a very short tail, real small eyes and ears, because again, they're underground all the time. They don't need to have larger eyes and ears. Seldom do they venture from their burrows. They spend most of their time in their burrows digging holes, trying to access the roots of weeds or plants. They come out of their holes only enough to push the dirt out and jump right back in. Also, pocket gophers are very solitary. They live by themselves. I'll be talking more about the density of the pocket gophers, but it is very low compared to ground squirrels. Ground squirrels, on the other hand, are often seen scurrying around on the ground. They're in colonies. There would be a bunch of little mounds. They interact with each other a lot. They spend a lot of time outside. They're feeding on grasses and forbs. So they don't feed underground. They feed above ground. That's why you see them there. They have short, hairy tails, and they have bigger eyes and ears than a pocket gopher. So they're real easy to tell apart. Biggest difference you can see right away physically, pocket gophers are little, 6 to 8 inches as adults, whereas ground squirrels are 9 to 15 inches. So there's big differences in the two. The reason you need to not just call them gophers when you're looking at control methods is because different things are effective and not effective and legal and not legal. The biggest difference in pocket gophers when people call you is to ask them, are the holes plugged up or are the holes open? If you're seeing mounds of dirt and the holes are plugged and you really can't see where something's going in and out, those are pocket gopher mounds. If you're looking at ground squirrel mounds, not only are they more packed down, but they also have open holes that the ground squirrels go in and out. So that's the difference between ground squirrels and pocket gophers, and as obvious as it should be, it is amazing how often I see the wrong things being used for the wrong animals. In Idaho and certainly other states in the West, you really need to be sure you're looking at a ground squirrel that is not protected. There are species, especially in Idaho, with the northern Idaho ground squirrel, which is threatened, and the southern Idaho ground squirrel. They're found in rather small areas, but you do need to make sure that you're not controlling them in those areas or you can run into big trouble. And by the way, in every state, there are species or subspecies usually that I might not be aware of that you need to be familiar with. So again, that's why that call to the local wildlife agency telling them you're going to be controlling ground squirrels and asking them if there's any species or subspecies that you need to be aware of in that area. That's the safest way to take care of it. Okay, the ground squirrels, as I mentioned, they're 9 to 15 inches long. When they're adults, they're very visible. They do hibernate during the winter. That's why we don't see them much. Even though on a nice winter day, you might see their heads poking up through the snow. And they'll sometimes run around and then they go back down in the holes. Their mounds are not as high as what the prairie dog mounds would be if you're in an area where there's prairie dog. They aren't as visible. Quite often they'll make a hole that's just right in the grass and you don't even see a mound. So that's the difference there with the prairie dogs. The main ones that I'm going to talk about today, because they're the most common, at least in the western part of the United States. The northern areas is the Columbian ground squirrel and the Richardson's ground squirrel. Timing of the year, because some of them are for example, the Columbian ground squirrel is a higher elevation animal. Everything is a little bit later. I'm sure that if you're in the southern part of the West, the ground squirrels that you have there are going to have a whole different yearly schedule than the ones we have here, but the basics of it is going to be the same in terms of what you need to know for control. Ground squirrel damage is usually a problem when the holes are dangerous to livestock or when they damage turf or lawn areas. They definitely can remove forage and cause damage to forage, and we don't just say remove because quite often their digging and their mounds can destroy as much forage as what they eat. Here in Montana, we did a research project and found that there's over $12 million lost each year in Montana to ground squirrels. And that's in alfalfa alone. That doesn't count dryland hays or even irrigated hays or other kinds of pastures. And so it's really pretty significant. They really do use a lot of the forage, a lot of the vegetation. So as we look at controlling ground squirrels, we want to look at all the things that we were talking about. First thing we'll talk about is habitat modification. We might consider to control ground squirrels. Without a doubt, they're not as happy in the tall grasses. It's not like prairie dogs where they won't use these tall grass areas or lop them off, but it's just that they like the shorter grass areas. And so if you have tall grass areas, they're not as likely to be in there. Certainly one of the habitat modifications that we can do is to get rid of those mounds and plug the holes that exist in a colony after you've controlled it. And I'll talk more about that later and why that is critically important that we do that. Cultural things that we might consider is to rotate crops frequently. Obviously, if you're in a cropland situation and the ground is being tilled or cleared and there's nothing to eat, they're not going to be likely to establish or stay in the areas. So frequent crop rotation or even any kind of tillage kind of destroys the habitat that they've had just through some of the practices that we might have in farming. When you do till, though, often we see a concentration of the ground squirrels in the border areas, and they also serve as a reservoir to reinfest an area. Flood irrigation, for obvious reasons, keeps the ground squirrels from being able to thrive or survive in an area. Again, the border areas that aren't flooded, they still maintain the ground squirrels. Exclusion, not practical in a lot of situations. I do know some golf courses that have tried to put barriers up between areas that ground squirrels occur. Here there's some bait stations that they put along these barriers. Ground squirrels could easily get over that, but their thought was if they could somehow make them hang around in that area longer, they might get to the bait station. In this particular instance, this was sent to me because the gentleman said that it did work. They did end up not having ground squirrels out in their fairways, but they did have ground squirrels in the areas behind the barriers. But normally, ground squirrels are very hard to exclude. Repellents, if a dog or a cat's out in the yard, ground squirrels just rather not be there. But there really are not any ultrasonic devices or sprays or anything like that that are practical in terms of keeping ground squirrels out of an area. Removal is often the thing that we have to go to control ground squirrels. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about that because there sure are ways that it can be done right, and there's ways that we can be fooling ourselves into thinking we are really having an effect. Shooting, no doubt, that's all across the West. People want to shoot ground squirrels. But before I go into all the different methods, I need to point out some critical things. And this says ground squirrels in Montana, but the fact is, any place in the West, you could make a yearly schedule like this to know when you are best to be successful in controlling ground squirrels. March, at least in Montana, is when they first come out of hibernation. The males emerge first and the females emerge about 2 weeks later. And that's a real important thing, because when those males come out, they are setting up their territories, they're determining their dominance hierarchies, they're very active, but the females are still down below, so that's not a good time to control them. The best time to control them is 2 weeks later. That's when females emerge, breeding occurs, they're looking around for any food that they can find. They're very active, they're hungry, the sunny days make them want to be outside, and that's the time to control them. The other big thing is, if you control them then, before the young are born, you have less animals that you have to control, and you have a greater effect, because if you get rid of that one female, well, obviously all of her offspring are also not going to be running around in September. So that blue area, that green line there, is the one to remember. That's the optimal time of the year to control ground squirrels. 2 weeks after the males emerge, which again is one of those situations where you better plan way ahead of time, because once they emerge, you got to be ready to go. You can't start gathering up whatever you're going to use to control them. And so along about in April, the pregnancy is occurring. The young are born at the end of April and into May. They don't come out of their holes usually for a couple to 3 weeks to a month. And once the young are out there running around, your control methods are just not as effective. The other time of the year that is critically important is fall dispersal. In the fall of the year, mama kicks those babies out of the holes and says, go find your own place to live for the winter. And in the fall of the year, the young are going to go look for holes, they're going to make new holes. You might see them going cross country, looking for places to set up a den. 80% mortality occurs when those juveniles disperse. That's a very critical thing to know. When those young are kicked out, there's real high mortality. If, however, there are vacant burrows nearby because of control attempts that took a low percentage of the population, that survival rate is flipped around. The mortality rate, is flipped around to where we actually have 80% survival. Because instead of having to go cross country or dig a hole and be exposed to predators and exposed to the elements, they just go over to the hole that Uncle Joe used to live in, and they are going to survive, and they're going to be very successful. So this is something to keep in mind as you're doing your control programs, that if vacant burrows are available, there's going to be some concerns there. And that's why I like to talk about shooting next, because the fact is, shooting can be a recreational thing. It can be expensive, or it might even be free if you have people come in from the outside and do it. But you can spend a lot of time controlling ground squirrels by shooting them. And so as long as it's fun, I guess it's an okay thing to do. And as I said, some people have turned it into a recreational enterprise where they charge people to come and shoot their ground squirrels. And so they're looking at ground squirrels in a totally different way. When will it work? There's not many places that it will work. It certainly can't work if you're someplace near houses or you have livestock around. It will quite often in more rural areas, it'll be a good way to get rid of some ground squirrels. But this is one of those things that will never control a ground squirrel population, because what you basically have done is gotten them smart enough to the point that all that is left are the smart ones, the wary ground squirrels. You shoot the easy ones, and you leave a lot of holes vacant for the juveniles to go in the fall of the year. And when I talk about people shooting as their method of ground squirrel control, generally it is an every year thing, because the next spring the population is just as high as it would have been if they hadn't done anything. So that's one of the things. I'm not saying shooting's bad. Again, just know that this is the limitations of trying to control ground squirrels through shooting. Trapping through the use of conibear traps. It's a body gripping trap that you can place over the hole. It can be very effective. It's time consuming. The capture kill rate is real high. You put that trap over the hole, and the ground squirrel can look at it for 3 hours if it wants to, but eventually it's going to try to get through there. When it does, it gets caught. You have to be careful, even though these conibear traps are the smallest that they make. They're called 110 conibear. They still can sure pinch a dog, and a cat they can be very lethal on because it'll catch them right behind the jaws. So you don't want to use them in an area where you have cats running around, and certainly smaller dogs. Bigger dogs, it won't kill them, but it'll sure make them unhappy if it catches them around the muzzle. There's not a real good reason for them to be wanting to poke their heads into the holes, any one hole that's got a trap over it versus one that doesn't. But again, that potential is there, and you should be aware of it. The conibear traps, as I said, are placed right over the hole with the triggering mechanism in the center of the hole, so that the ground squirrel has to pass through that to get caught. Works real well in areas where you have low populations of ground squirrels, or as a cleanup after a large-scale toxicant program has been used. The conibear trap should be considered because they can be pretty effective. Fumigants, that's another thing that can be used to control ground squirrels. It's quite labor intensive. You put the gas cartridges down into the ground, and you light them, and then you plug up the hole, and the animals actually become monoxinated down in the hole. The time it takes is because, one, you need to plug up the holes to seal it up, or the gas just comes out. And then, of course, there's a lot of holes out there, so you have to use a lot of the cartridges. A little less expensive method is the use of phostoxin tablets. That is a restricted use product. The same principle, though. The phostoxin tablets are put down into the holes, and the holes are then plugged so that the gases are formed in there. What happens with phostoxin tablets is when it mixes with soil moisture, a phosphine gas is formed. And this phosphine gas is what really kills the animal. Because it is a phosphine gas, it can be very deadly to people too, and so that's why it's restricted use, and both the handling and use of it is very important, and those label restrictions become very critical. But it does work well. Fumigants can work quite well with ground squirrels. As I said, it's just expensive. Can't talk about ground squirrels without talking about the roadnator. A lot of people kind of like the idea of that big boom, and it is a lot of fun, and you see a lot of dirt fly, and you certainly feel that anything that's down in the ground there is going to be killed. And so this roadnator is a device that injects gas down into the ground. It has a little igniter on it that lights that gas, and so anything down there in the ground will be killed. Unless, of course, the tunnel system has some ups and downs and dips in it that can form a pocket to keep the gas from getting in there, unless you miss some areas, unless you don't have the money to buy a roadnator. Roadnators are very expensive. $2,000 is kind of a starting point on them. Certainly the gas is expensive. The operator costs, having access to the areas that you want to put them in. But certainly the roadnators are something that everybody asks about, because and I've seen them demonstrated, and it really is. It's a fun thing. You have a big group of people there in a workshop, and the guy goes out and puts the roadnator down in the ground and puts the gas in and sparks it, and it goes boom, and everybody laughs and thinks, man, that's really neat. But and some people have had some pretty good luck with them, but it's just not really the most inexpensive or efficient way. Monty Sullins, the Montana Department of Ag vertebrate control specialist, did some work a few years back evaluating the roadnators, and he never could get as much kill with the roadnator as he did with some of the other toxicants that were properly used. So anyways, that's the roadnator. Now we'll talk about the toxicants, because in general, especially on a larger scale operation, the toxicants are what's usually the most cost effective. They're the things that generally are going to be used because they work and because, excuse me, because they can be cost effective. Restricted use pesticides, obviously you need to watch out for the non-target species. You need to follow the label directions. You need to be very careful. Little deviation here so I can get on my bandwagon. Strychnine is illegal for ground squirrel control. Probably more people know about using strychnine for ground squirrel control than anything else, and yet it is illegal and it really doesn't work as good. Why do they use it? Well, because you can go to the garden stores, the home and garden stores, and there it says gopher bait. And what is it? It is strychnine. They're talking about pocket gophers. You can use it for pocket gophers, but you can't use it for ground squirrels. Strychnine can only be used underground. So there's no wonder that people end up using it illegally when you can see racks and racks of this stuff that these people are going to be using for their ground squirrels, not for their pocket gophers. So as educators and people providing information, it's very important that we help people understand this. Strychnine, when used above ground, can be very deadly. It can be picked up by birds, it can be picked up by deer, things like that, and so that's why it's no longer labeled for use except underground on pocket gophers. There are things that we have that work quite well, and I'll be talking about those, and those really, if they're used properly, you'll have every bit as good of luck as you would with strychnine. There are a lot of problems inherent with using the strychnine, and some of them can really lead to some problems legally and large fines, and we've had it happen. And all it takes is one person to see a dead bald eagle laying out in the field. They call the investigators, they come and look around, and lo and behold, there's somebody controlling ground squirrels, and there's strychnine above the ground. And that's when all of a sudden things can get very unpleasant. So again, can't emphasize enough to make sure people aren't using strychnine. And I'll go one step further. When you look at your local garden supply places, big box stores, whatever they might be, and you see strychnine there, and they have the word gopher advertising it, let them know that people are going to assume you're talking about ground squirrels if you use the word gopher, and they're going to get in trouble if they use it. And believe me, that person is not going to be less likely to get in trouble because they can say, well, that's what it said at the store, because we're supposed to read the label instructions. In fact, just last summer, it was one of the situations where a lady was trying to kill a couple ground squirrels in her yard. The neighbors across the fence were liking the ground squirrels running around, and so when they saw the poison there, the teenage son was reaching across trying to get the poison out of there so that the ground squirrels wouldn't eat it, and that was strychnine. And here's this young fella grabbing the strychnine with his hand. So again, there's a lot of inherent problems with that. All right, so let's talk about using toxicants legally and effectively. Certainly, the toxic baits are lethal to a lot of different animals. When used properly, you shouldn't have a problem with livestock being poisoned, but I always tell people when you're controlling, when you're putting out these toxicants, remove the livestock. That way, if something does get sick a little later, they're not wondering what it is, but to remove the livestock from the pastures that you're treating. Again, applying in the spring from the chart that I showed you is the only way to do it. I mean, a lot of the other times of the year, you're wasting your time. Apply it in the spring, the population's the lowest, it'll cost you less money, you use less bait, and so there's less non-target hazard. So that's the way to do it. And again, the earlier in the spring, is if you can see those ground squirrels running around, and you can have that out there then before the little green grass shoots come up, they're going to be much more likely to take it than they are when there's a lot of fresh green grass growing. Zinc phosphide is probably the least expensive, and it is very effective. It is a restricted use. Like the phosphotoxin tablets I was talking about, it forms a phosphine gas when it is mixed with saliva. So they only have to eat a couple grains of it. It mixes with the saliva and it kills them. It's 80 to 95% effective, but you've got to use it properly. It doesn't taste good. It's got a bitter taste to it, and so the bait shyness will occur. But if you use it properly, they'll have a couple kernels of that in their mouth and get the phosphine gas before they realize that it tastes bitter and they don't like it. One of the things that's important so they do get this lethal dose quickly is, again, before spring green up, make sure you put it out there before there's other choices for them to eat. Very important thing to pre-bait with clean oats. You want them to step out of their hole, see this foreign substance, pick around at it, eat it, and find out, wow, this is really good stuff. Then, 2 days later, when you put the same type of bait out there, but this time with the toxicant on it, they will get enough of it in their mouth quickly that it'll kill them quickly. Okay? And again, follow the label instructions, but applying 1 teaspoon near each burrow is what's important. It can be done rather quickly if you have a container that you're carrying the phostoxin in, the zinc phosphide in, and you make a little spoon that has 1 teaspoon, and you drop it at the hole. You don't put it down in the hole. You put it outside the hole, and you put it out exactly like you did the pre-bait. And if you follow those label instructions, not only is that for safety, but it's also so it is most effective. I mentioned before that if you wait until there's some green grass, if you look closely in this picture, you'll see that there's some of the zinc phosphide granules laying there. And they will still take it here, but not like they would if that green stuff hadn't already grown up. Having a crew of people to treat a field can make the job quite quick. You can do things a lot faster if you have a team of people going across the field. Of course, being sure that everyone has the proper gloves and eyewear and everything else. And you go up and down the field, keeping track of where you are so that you don't spend a lot of time walking across areas that you've already done. Another toxicant is Rosol. Rosol is a restricted use product, but it is different from the zinc phosphide in that it is an anticoagulant bait. That means instead of a single lethal dose to kill them, they need to feed on this a few times. They need to have at least 2 doses, because what happens is it causes their blood to not coagulate. And once it's in their system, they will then die of internal bleeding. Generally, they'll die down in the hole and out of sight, but sometimes it's up above. The pre-baiting, I have mixed feelings on that. They recommend it. There's a reason that they recommend it. It's because you would be pre-baiting with something that looks totally different from the product. And so the animal really is used to eating something else, but it's really not something that it's familiar with. And generally on our projects, we don't pre-bait. And the main reason for that is because ground squirrels love Rosol. We have actually treated areas, come back to the pickup when we're loading up our buckets again and look down, and here's a ground squirrel already out there eating the Rosol. It just tastes good to them. And so, but the critical thing is that you have to have the 2 doses. So you need to be thinking of a period of time, not only when you're going to have warm weather, but when it's not going to rain on it and different things like that. So you kind of have to consider all that. In Montana, we can use that in bait stations now, and I'll talk more about bait stations in a moment. But this is good because they like it so much. If you put something in a bait station that they really like, they'll continue visiting that bait station, and it'll work a lot better. Bait stations are simply containers that hold the toxicant, always anticoagulant baits. That's all that's used in bait stations. And then the ground squirrels will run around. They'll go into the hole along the bottom, and then they will access the poison grain, which is stored up in the upright part. I say poison grain, many times it's a different kind of a product than a grain. Some of it's a processed material. I'll talk about that in a minute. But anyways, and so that's how it works. You need to have them so they can get to them about every 50 yards. So you don't want to have them go over 50 yards. That means every 100 yards you have to put in a bait station. So for a large scale field, it can be not very practical. And I hesitate to say that because a lot of people have found it is very practical, and they're doing that rather than other kinds of poisons or trapping or things like that. So bait stations can work good. You can make them yourself. A piece of PVC pipe, generally 4-inch PVC pipe works the best. The stand-up part is really the storage. The grain falls down into the horizontal parts, and the ground squirrels will go into those and access it. Different things are done to keep the materials from falling out, and I'll show you some of those momentarily. Rammet green is probably used in bait stations more than any other product, primarily because it is general use. It's something that anybody can use, and because of that, people are using it in urban areas, especially a lot of developers are using it on vacant lots where they have to control ground squirrels, and the bait stations work good. They're low maintenance, but it is critically important that you keep a constant supply of the toxicant in the bait station. If you let it run out, then no longer are they going to have that internal bleeding potential going on, and all you're going to be doing is feeding them. So be sure that you keep those maintained. At the beginning, they're going to eat a whole lot of it, and then obviously as they start dying out, you won't need as much. But it's really important to keep those bait stations filled. About 1 per acre. So a lot of places it can take 1 to 2 weeks for familiarization, not just because of the product they have to get used to eating, but here's this very foreign thing out in the middle of their habitat, and they got to get used to crawling into that. Again, 5 to 10 days until death takes place from internal bleeding. Generally, they feel sick, they're down in their hole, but we often go back to these areas because sometimes we'll see one up on the surface that's sick. So it's probably good to get them. Secondary hazards are a lot less with the anticoagulant baits, but there is the potential for secondary poisoning to occur if a dog or something ate the entire carcass, including the stomach, and did it several days in a row. So the potential's there, but it's not as much as it would be with some other toxicants. A couple years ago, we did a project where we actually looked at the differences between using zinc phosphide, Rosol, Rammet green in a control area that we didn't do anything in. And certainly the zinc phosphide and Rosol did an awful lot to reduce the population. This was just in the first week, which was probably the shortcoming, because the Rammet green, which as I said takes 7 to 10 days for familiarization in the bait stations, didn't look like it did as much, but that's because it was just starting to work. So the Rammet green part of this study probably wasn't really a fair representation. But as you can see in the control, the ground squirrels were right where they were, in fact a little higher as opposed to the areas that we treated. So the zinc phosphide was the cheapest, of course, and the Rosol was next. And all of these you would expect to have better than 90% control on after 2 weeks or a period of time like that, if everything is done properly. Okay, and the last thing is the species-specific methods for controlling ground squirrels. Probably nobody comes up with the ideas that they have in Caddyshack, but the fact is there's things that people want to think about. Encouraging predators. That's always one of the things somebody will say, well, geez, we put up some perches out there for the hawks, and we've got some fox running around there. Shouldn't that control our ground squirrels? Well, definitely they will eat ground squirrels. All kinds of things eat ground squirrels. One of the basic tenets of wildlife management is that predators do not control prey populations. Prey control predator populations. There's always the diminishing return. The predator will work prey as long as they can get them. Once they spend too much effort there, they go someplace else, and that prey population will go back up. Now, that doesn't say that we shouldn't encourage the predator, but don't think that that is going to be a reasonable method of ground squirrel control, because they just can't get enough of them to do that. They get smart real quick, and they're also, don't forget, they evolved with these predators, and they have many behaviors and characteristics that allow them to avoid the predators. Gumballs, that's probably as common as the the roadinator, when somebody will say, well, what about these gumballs? I hear you can put gumballs out there and the ground squirrels eat them and it plugs them up and then they die. All right. Gumballs are not labeled for ground squirrel control. You always got to say that first. But the fact is, many of the people that have used gumballs, it really is anecdotal. You don't necessarily kill a ground squirrel because it eats a gumball. There is nothing saying that it will plug up its stomach. It's just things that people think would probably happen. Believe it or not, to dispense this, a couple years ago, I tried to get a little project going where I could capture some ground squirrels, feed some of them gumballs, and feed some of them nothing but good quality hay, and the university animal care committee wouldn't let me do it because gumballs were not a approved method of euthanasia. I wasn't real disappointed though, because I really didn't have much faith in this at all. It's just one of those things that, again, I don't ever say gumballs won't kill ground squirrels, because somebody will say, well, we put some gumballs out there, we don't have as many ground squirrels as we did now. So let's just say gumballs, yes, we know about them. No, they really haven't been tested. My understanding is we do have a county agent here in Montana that might be doing some unauthorized tests of this, but I haven't heard anything about that yet. Reclamation. Maybe one of the most important things about controlling your ground squirrel population. If you look at reclamation as being one of the most important things that can be done to prevent problems in the future, it is ridiculous not to go in and reclaim the land. Remember I talked about the making places for the juveniles to go, making places for the juveniles to move to when mama kicks them out? If you don't reclaim that land, that will happen. Reclamation can take many forms. I know people that have just drug a blade around the area that they have treated ground squirrels in, dragging dirt over the top of those holes, just plugging up those holes so that if an animal is dispersing in the fall of the year, it can't just go there and automatically have a place to live. The best reclamation also includes some kind of seeding or getting some kind of vegetation on top of the area in order to get it to grow so it's not as attractive to the ground squirrels. So reclamation is something that I really recommend. It's a good investment to prevent future problems. Okay, that's all I have on the ground squirrels. I will buy. Okay, is that working? All right. Okay, here there's a few things that I'd like to show you. First of all, we have when you're trapping ground squirrels, this is the conibear trap that I was talking about. It's called a body gripping trap. They're available online. You can really just do a search. You can find them for anywhere from $3 to $5 or $6 each. If you're buying by the dozen, they're quite cheap. I do know of people that get a couple dozen of these and run them across the entire pasture and keep moving them. They're set up so that once the trap is set, you put the prongs over the hole so that the ground squirrel has to go through that prong in order to get out. And so if you put that over the hole and they end up pushing on this, it goes down and catches them, and they will be there when you get to them. So that's the way the conibear traps work. There are other traps available, and you can look online to see those. This is one that is very expensive. They're like $35 a piece. But it's really a good product in an area where you might have dogs and cats. This is designed so that the hole that the ground squirrel will go in to get caught can only set the trap off from one way. In other words, the ground squirrel can only get caught if it is going in one direction, not the other direction. In other words, if you push on it, you put it in the hole and you push on it this way, it won't go off. So you put that over the hole so any dogs or anything that come there and push on it, they won't get caught. However, if you put this so the ground squirrel coming out of the hole in this direction, this will come down and it catches it. So these are good. They're really fast to set. You just poke them down in the ground right over the front of the hole, and then they come right out through that. You get them. So this works good. This is just a little scooper that we made. It's the ideal size when you're distributing the toxicant, especially the zinc phosphide, and that becomes real important so that you're using the proper amount and that you are putting it out in a consistent way. And we usually say about waist high, tip it over. It hits the ground and scatters just enough so that the ground squirrel can find it, but so that it also thinks, wow, I found something here, because it looks around and can find it, but they can get enough of it so that it'll work. And it's also what the label says is the proper amount to use. You won't be able to see these very good, but these are the different toxicants that are available. The zinc phosphide is a dark color. It doesn't, it's just kind of nondescript. This is on oats, and it's got the poison on top of that. You buy it, it's ready to use. This is the Ramic green. It's more of a little green ball. The product is very palatable, and it's crumbled and then put into those little balls. And then the Rosol is also a product which is put on a grain, and it is real green. Green is often used because it's not attractive to birds. All right, that's all I've got on that. We'll go back to the PowerPoint presentation now. Okay. All right, the other thing was we were talking about bait stations for ground squirrels. I've got a couple of these that I'd like to show you. The bait stations for ground squirrels are made out of 4-inch PVC. They can be very plain. They can be no more than just 3 pieces of PVC, a cap, and a T to make a station that you fill up with anticoagulant bait by removing the cap and then filling it up and put it back in. And as the ground squirrel go in the ends and eat up the bait, more of it falls down and they get it. Then you can get a little bit more sophisticated, and you can put a reducer inside here. Put a 3-inch to 2-inch reducer inside, and when you do that, it makes the opening smaller that the anticoagulant bait will go in. So you just drop that in there, and then put this back on, and it just keeps as much from falling in there so that they don't track it around. Some people have eliminated some spillage by putting a reducer on the end of one of the arms, and by putting a 4-inch to 3-inch reducer, it puts a little bit of a lip in here so that they don't track any of the grain out. This particular model also has the T and an elbow so that it stands up by itself. Most of these you have to have a piece of rebar or a fiberglass post that you drive in the ground and then tie this to it to hold them up, or put it up against the fence post. But anyway, these are quite a good deal. And I should mention that after you have used other methods of controlling the ground squirrels, sometimes it's good to put up bait stations so that when the neighbor's ground squirrels come over, they will encounter these bait stations and not reinfest your area so quickly. So that's all on the ground squirrels.